وعلى آله أجمعين أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم محمد رسول الله صدق الله العلي العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الكريم. Praise is due to Allah, whose worth cannot be described by speakers, whose bounties cannot be counted by reckoners, whose claim to obedience cannot be satisfied by those who attempt to do so, whom the height of intellectual courage cannot appreciate, the divings of understanding cannot reach, he for whose description no limit is laid down, no eulogy exists, no duration is fixed. Lord Almighty Allah sent His beloved, Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in fulfillment of His promise and completion of the prophethood. Please send with the Sharif in the court of Holy Majesty Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad. In respect of the biography of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, today we'll talk about the treaty that the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam struck between Muhajir Ansar and the Jews of Medina. This particular treaty has been referred to as Sahifa by some scholars. According to a tradition, after the arrival of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Medina, the Prophet of Allah had this particular meeting with the Jews of Medina and established, in today's terminology, a constitution for Medina, the protection of Medina, the safety of the people of Medina, the safety of Muslims and all those who dwelt in Medina. And that's why the scholars, particularly modern scholars, they call this treaty between Muslims and Jews as the first constitution that was ever written by any civilization in the known history. The Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam laid down the rules of governance, laid down the articles for rendering justice, and the article that talks about fairness and the treatment of people with kindness and generosity based on faith as well as the civil requirements. And that's why this particular statement, which was written in the form of articles, the Charter of Protection, the Charter of the rendering of justice, as Sahifa by quite a few scholars. Ibn Hisham probably is the one who had written down almost all the articles which were there in this charter. And naturally, according to him, he got it from Ibn Ishaq. There were more than 50 articles, 50 clauses and phrases that you find in Ibn Hisham. And in other works of the biography of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, only few clauses have been mentioned, but the emphasis was laid on the deal between the Muhajir, Ansars and the Jews. The Jews had three tribes there known as Banu Nazir, Banu Qaynuqa, Banu Khurayza. And naturally, you have lots of tribes of Ansar there in Medina, which included Aus and Khazraj. But their different branches, Bani Auf was there, Bani Haris was there. There were quite a few such tribes. And in the document that we have in Ibn Hisham, we'll find each of these tribes of Ansars had been mentioned separately, and everywhere else the statement that got attached with that the people would follow the order of Lord Almighty Allah, the order and the command of Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There were vows that they would stick to this particular constitution, this particular charter of protection. And it is said, dear servants of the Prophet of Allah, the traditions with respect to, say, the killing and the murder which had been in practice in those tribes were also retained by the Prophet. For example, the matter with respect to killing, you have to have qisas, that is to say, the murder resembles the punishment. That is to say, the crime resembles the punishment. If somebody kills somebody else, in return, he was also killed. Likewise, if the person who suffered, the guardian or the people who are related to the ones who are killed, if they forgive, it's a different thing. So according to the Islamic tradition, Islamic custom, you have the rules of deed, you have the rules of khubaha, blood money as it is said, and you have qisas, the taking of the revenge in equal terms. Dear servants of the Prophet of Allah, Holy Majesty, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam had made it very clear in this treaty that the enemy should be treated the same way by all, the Muslims as well as Jews. And the participation in the war and the bearing of the expenses of the war should be equal, in a sense that the people who are participating, they would also bear the same expenses as Muslims do. For they were allowed to practice their religion in respect of the Jews, but in return Muslims would provide them protection, so on and so forth. Unless it is a war of faith. If the war broke between, say, Muslim and Jews, then in that case this may not apply. But when it comes to the outsiders, the Muslims and Jews were supposed to go together and fight. Dear servants of the Prophet of Allah, it was also said that no infidel, no non-Muslim, the people who are from Quraysh of Makkah, they were not supposed to be given any kind of sanctuary or refuge by either the Muslims or the Jews. Against the wishes of the Muslims, if Jews tried to help them, this would be considered as a breach of the treaty. Likewise, Muslims were not supposed to help non-Muslims against any Muslim. And whatever the decision that they make, before that they are supposed to take the permission of Holy Majesty Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Nobody was supposed to start any war without the permission of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So these were the rules that had been laid down to protect the people who dwelled in Medina. But the history showed that the way Jews had in reality breached the treaty, and cheated Muslims, so on and so forth. We'll discuss this in the coming lecture also. Inshallah, please send Durood Sharif in the court of Holy Majesty. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi.